It's impossible to think about life without thinking of its inevitable end. We all lead our lives constantly aware of its eventual endgame, treating it like our greatest enemy, to be feared and dreaded with every passing moment. But death is just a part of life, isn't it? Just like life, neither good nor bad. Death is simply what it is, an essential part of our existence that is what we make of it. Something we all experience in one form or another no matter what we do. Either we're the ones that experience it firsthand, or we're the ones left in the wake of those who pass on. It's not easy regardless, but it is something each and every one of us will have to contend with at some point, one way or another. And because of the complexity and the emotions dealing with it involves, every culture mythology has developed their own way of viewing and perceiving it. In Christian mythology, it's contended that you will either go to paradise or to misery, depending on your life and the deeds you committed within it. While atheism contends that life simply ends, with no continuation of any kind, just for a couple easily recognizable examples in Western cultures. But the perception of death I want to focus on today actually comes from Hindu philosophy, which stipulates that our bodies are just mortal vessels for our souls. That when we die, we are simply releasing our souls in order to be born anew. It's a philosophy that isn't meant to soften the pain that death can bring, but allow us to accept it as a friend and ally in our final days. That death is merely part of the natural cycle that repeats until our soul truly finds peace and balance. Granted, this is a very surface-level explanation of a small piece of Hinduism, the complexities of which I won't even pretend to understand beyond the most basic concepts. But it's still a fascinating interpretation of how we exist before and after our death. And to explore this Hindu concept further, let's examine The Many Deaths of Laila Starr, written by Ram V. with art by Felipe Andrande and published by Boom Studios in 2021. It begins on a Wednesday afternoon in Mumbai, just as the December sun begins to set. A woman named Mrs. Shraw is being rushed through traffic. Her baby is in the process of being born. Meanwhile, the TI Media Studies class of 2019 is having a final year party on the 6th floor of the Arya Towers. A woman sits by the window with a cigarette, lost in her thoughts, as the man she's not listening to continues to ramble on. And this is when we're introduced to our protagonist, Death, who is going up to the top of the Silver Tower to meet with Brahma, the god of creation, knowledge, and Vedas. He tells Death that, unfortunately, they're restructuring her entire department and she's going to be let go. Having had the job for all eternity, she's understandably more than a little upset. But Brahma explains that the reason for this is because a man reborn today that will one day discover the secrets to eternal life. Despite her protests, Death is forced to accept her fate, to be cast out and forced to live life as a mortal. At the same time, the woman with the cigarette is falling to the ground, unclear whether she fell or jumped, and Mrs. Shraw is having her baby in the hospital. But Death isn't quite ready to give up yet. She knows where the baby has just been born, and she asks Agni, the Hindu god of fire, to place her in the mortal body close to him. Meanwhile, the woman has been declared dead from her injuries and placed in the morgue. 20 minutes later, Death enters the young woman's body and breathes new life for the first time. As she's trying to get her bearings, she realizes she's in the presence of something otherworldly. The ghost of a little girl named Munmun, who says she's there because she likes to watch people get brought back to life. Granted, this doesn't typically take 20 minutes. She points out to Death that the name of the body she's inhabiting is on her wrist, that being the name of Laila Starr. It isn't long, though, until she collects herself and focuses on her mission, finding the baby. She explains to Munmun that she is the incarnation of Death, and she's there to stop him before he can invent immortality. Munmun is quick to read the subtext of her mission and is rightfully horrified that she's planning to kill a baby because she got fired. Laila quickly finds the baby and prepares to do what she feels she must. When Munmun interjects, the baby's name is Darius, and she can't kill someone that has a name. She goes on to explain that she's seen her share of broken people, sometimes rich, sometimes poor, sometimes a family, and sometimes alone. But regardless, each one experiences a moment. Amid the pain and despair and all the indignities of a dying body, there is a moment of grace. It's always sad and never easy. Laila finds that she can't go through with it. The resulting cries from the baby alert the hospital staff to her activities. She proceeds to make a break for it, even getting some help from Munmun, and makes her way back to Mumbai streets. Unfortunately for her, however, traffic in Mumbai doesn't stop, and she's quickly run over by a massive truck, killing her for the first, or technically second, time. Luckily for her, though, she still has friends on the other side. She's given a second chance by Prana, the god of life, who professes only to himself that she means the world to him. He explains what has happened to her as she wakes, after which she frustratingly asks how he could allow such a baby with such a fate to exist. He replies that all he does is give them a lifetime. What they do with it is up to them. But, if she's still interested, he's 8 years old now. The next chapter opens with a crow flying down next to Laila, and she finds, after asking a few rhetorical questions that he answers with surprising articulation, that this is no ordinary crow. He explains that his name is Ka, and he is a funeral crow. See, when people die here, sometimes the last rite calls for crows, leaving rice for them to signal that they are needed, at which point they take the soul away to the afterlife. The crow asks Laila if she wants to go to the funeral with him. She agrees, seeing no reason not to. Meanwhile, Darius Shaw has recently run away from home while his parents are still at work and his grandmother wasn't paying attention. It wouldn't be far, and it would only be for the night, but it was an important night, as it would be his first conversation with death in more ways than one, because he was there to remember a friend. Back before he moved into the city with his family, he lived in an old bungalow outside the city that had mango, jackfruit, and sapodilla trees resting in the plot behind the house. They required tending every summer. To accomplish this, Darius' family hired a man named Barden from the south. As our narrator describes, he was a man with granite skin and tired amber eyes, tall as trees and quiet as a still summer air. Darius became fascinated by this man, and the two created a wonderful friendship together, with Darius plying him with the questions that arise from childhood, and Barden answering each one with the gentle patience of a man made of stone. The jackfruit were the hardest each summer to harvest, needing to be cut down and freed from their tough exterior. The treasures within was given to Darius' family, and he loved them, but wondered why Barden wasn't allowed to eat any of the fruit himself, only allowed some boiled rice, stew, and a tumbler of milk. In fact, he wasn't allowed in the house at all for any reason. When Darius questioned why he couldn't give Barden any of the fruit, he was simply told that they're not for him. But Darius chose not to listen, running to Barden and gifting him 2 jackfruits of his own. Barden accepts the fruit and held them gently in his hand while he told Darius to never forget him. Time passed, Darius moved into the city with his family, and Barden was no longer a part of the young boy's life. That is, until his daughter visited the Shaw family to deliver some unfortunate news. Barden had passed away. His parents thought going to the funeral would be inappropriate, but Darius didn't care. He wanted to see the man whose shoulders he rode on one last time, to try to understand this vague concept of death. And that brings us back to now, with Laila and Ka sitting and watching the funeral from a distance, while she tells him of how she tried to kill the boy. She's the avatar of death, after all. It should have been easy. But now that she's mortal, it's different. She questions the obsession with death mortals have, the ceremony, the gravity of rituals, but Ka explains that they feel that way because it is the one thing that is theirs. Not death, but what they leave behind. They burn the bodies because they believe that the soul is immortal, and the mortal shell must be removed so the soul can be reincarnated into the next cycle. But once that's done, all that's left are the memories. To be witnessed by someone else and to be remembered when you are gone, these are the things that belong to mortals, Ka explains. I wonder if you ever remember those that you took. But taking a life as a mortal, you need to live with that. It's different. Ka tells her that they are on the shores of Waukesha, just off the Arabian Sea, where ashes are often dispersed. They say the water holds the memories of all things committed to it, and with that, he leaves her to participate in the ritual, leaving Laila alone with her thoughts. But shortly after, she sees the small crying boy walking along the shore. She goes to check on the child, and he uses the moment to grieve, to work through his first experience with death. He explains how he saw Barden as a god, a creature from another world that was left here by mistake. And how can one such as he die? Laila explains to the boy that she's learned today that dying and going away forever are 2 very different things. If life's an exercise in making memories, no one really goes away as long as we remember them. The pyre is lit, releasing the soul of the gentle giant, while Darius declares he will never forget him, holding 2 jackfruits carefully in his hands. He then proceeds to run away, with Laila running after him for reasons even she's not sure. But she loses him in the crowd, and she is pushed to participate in the ritual, leading a handful of marigolds to the sea. As she does so, She overhears Mrs. Shaw calling her son's name and embraces him in her arms. Laila realizes that the boy she spoke to was the one she's after, but realizes too late. As the memories committed to sea, the countless souls of those she has reaped reach out for her and drag her into the sea. She's pulled out by Ka. Laila thanks him for saving her, but Ka reminds her that he's a funeral crow. He's not saving her, he is carrying her soul. She awakens again 12 years later, Prana once again bringing her back to the land of the living. This time, she takes a different approach. Instead of looking for Darius, Laila instead indulges in the high life of clubs, of loud music, of food, drinks, sex, and more. But her greatest indulgence is cigarettes. She pulls the last one from her pocket and lights it up, placing it on a nearby coffee table, still burning as she leaves to enjoy the revelries of youth. Not that the cigarette would be alone for long, as they are soon joined on the couch by young Darius, believing himself to be alone. That is, until his girlfriend Anika approaches him and kisses him passionately, before announcing that she's breaking up with him. But to understand why, we need to go back for a minute. Back to an abandoned pillow factory, where the two would spend time together with a third member of their troupe, Zafar. And it is here where they would share all of the thoughts, secrets, and indulgences that come with budding adulthood. Zafar, for his part, found the place after doing a photo shoot there and adopted it as his own, passing the secret to Darius, who brought Danica along. And the others seemed to go along with the eccentricities of a man who would claim such a ruin as his kingdom. Back in the present, Darius goes to the balcony to smoke and contemplate his heartbreak, finding Laila with another woman out as well. He's struck with an astonishing sense of deja vu, like a lost child holding his heart in his hand once more, abandoned on some unfamiliar shores. Laila goes to check on him, once again not realizing who she's talking to, and once again, Darius uses the opportunity to grieve. Not just the loss of his relationship, but also the loss of his best friend. He explains that he and Zafar fought before he died about his girlfriend, trading blows in the decaying ruins of his kingdom. Words were exchanged, and the pair separated with hate in their eyes. Unfortunately for Zafar, a riot would break out shortly after, burning the pillow factory along with numerous other places in the city. He never made it out, and all the memories, the secrets, the scrawlings on the wall went with him, leaving nothing behind but ash and soot. He explains that they fought a lot because he wanted to be like him, that a part of him burned away with him, leaving only half of himself. And what woman can love half a boy? Laila retorts that that's what happens when things die. They go away, but you don't realize all the parts of you they were holding up until after. And in the days that follow, the possibilities of what could have been begin to fall away, leaving you with less each time, more precious to be savored, like a cigarette. She offers Darius the last of hers, which he takes before asking sarcastically what makes her such an expert on life. She says nothing, and he walks away, chucking the last of the cigarette on the floor. A fire breaks out sometime after, likely caused by the burning embers of a cigarette. Luckily, most everyone made it out safely. Well, all but one. We cut to some time later with Prana and Laila sitting on the docks as he berates her for dying as recklessly as she has, and states that she's gonna get him in trouble. Laila scoffs at this, saying that they love him up there, that the whole world is an ode to him. Her, on the other hand, they don't have need for her anymore. Prana disagrees, saying that he has nothing without her. She laughs. Tell that to Darius Shaw. Prana then reveals that not only was he at the party that night, but he's been keeping tabs on him and knows where he is, handing her his address. She takes the address and goes to find him, 16 years after her third death. Her journey to find the address, however, leads her to a Chinese temple, the spirit of which Laila is able to hear as they welcome her into their sanctum. She asks the temple why there is no one else there. The temple replies that Wei is usually there, but not today. Wei is an old Asian man who is usually the first person to be on the street each morning to sweep the temple steps, and spends time within their doors, leaving only for lunch. And then, upon leaving, closes only the latch, a gesture they appreciate. Wei had lived there their entire lives before the temple was even built. The child of an immigrant father from Hainan, China, to work the mills in Bombay. And while all the others in his family eventually left for one reason or another, Wei always stayed, and thus the two are of a kind. Wei, the last of the mill worker immigrants, and they being the last Chinese temple in the city. Laila listens intently before asking if they can help her find the address she's looking for. They do so gladly, but asks if she'd be willing to check in on Wei if she can, since it's not far from where she's going. She agrees and departs for Darius' home. Upon arrival, she finds the door unlocked and enters, albeit cautiously. Inside, she finds that Darius has received much of what anyone can want at the age of 36. A beautiful home, wealth, fame, respect, a job that brought him joy, and a family he greatly loved. And yet, despite all this, there is a heaviness that lingers in the air, making its presence known. That's when Darius finds her, recognizing her immediately and telling her to sit. Much to Laila's surprise, this is not a man enjoying the treasures he's gained over the course of his life. This man is sad, broken, carrying the sunken eyes of grief and apathy. He asks her how this is possible, how the woman he met 16 years ago looks like she hasn't aged a day. Laila hesitates, but tells him the truth, that she used to be a god, and now she lives in the body of Laila Starr. He asks what kind, to which she tries to dodge the question, but Darius isn't having it. Because he looked into her after the fire, and in doing so remembered her as the woman he met when he was only 8. This cannot be, he thinks. But you don't forget these things. The memories are immortal. They refine themselves to perfection over time. I remember your face, and it has not changed. And that's when he pieced it all together. He met her after Barden died, and then again after Safar. So once again he asks, "Who are you?" Knowing she's been made, she doesn't hide the truth. She confesses to be Death, and a grief-stricken man lashes out, shouting in her face, demanding to know why. Why she took his wife. Why she took his best friend and business partner. How is he supposed to go on? She protests, saying that she's not Death anymore, but Darius doesn't believe her, screaming that no one gets as many chances as she does. What makes her so special? And for the first time, Laila is afraid. Not of Death, nor of Darius, but of the possibility of going on like this. The idea of having to live with it. A tangled mess of emotions, living a life full of questions and utterly bereft of answers. At that moment, Darius' son walks into the room, and Darius stops his onslaught. He takes him in his arms and declares that he will find a way to keep her from taking any more of them. There will be no place for Death here. Not anymore. And thus, Laila runs from the house as fast as she can, trying to outrun the words that follow closely behind. And in the rain, when the beating of her heart becomes too much, she finally succumbs to guilt for the first time. But she's not sure why. None of this is her fault, after all. But then she remembers the conversations she had with Munmun, with Ka, with Darius. Perhaps this is what it felt like to bear whatever little part humanity that was not hers to carry. She sits in the rain for hours outside Wei's shawl until the sun goes down. And then she sees crows overhead, and the crowd dressed in white, confirming to her what she already knew. Wei had passed away. She returns to the temple to tell them the news before breaking down in grief all her own. The temple offers her refuge for the night, and asks her to keep the door open when she leaves in the morning. Maybe someone else will come in. But unfortunately, the flooding from the storm causes the temple to collapse, and Laila along with it. 28 years later, she reads a newspaper story of the flood with Para, noting sorrowfully that she thinks the temple collapsed because they couldn't go on without their friend. Para makes her tea and tells her he had a hard time bringing her back this time and had to make a deal with all manner of gods to do so. He doesn't think they like her very much, but Laila doesn't care. It's not like she'll see any of them again anyway. After all, she's the one that pushed Darius into discovering immortality in the first place. Para isn't so sure, though. As he notes, he hasn't done so far, and he's running out of time. We are then transported to a quiet beach off the southern edge of Goa, where a little girl named Gilly has found a small puppy underneath the pile of scaffolding. The poor dog was starving and could barely breathe with his paw broken. The adults told her there was nothing they could do to save the little one, but Gilly would not give up that easily. For there is one person 6 miles away who might be able to help. Where there lived a crazy old man, his mind decayed by drugs and booze, who would take any seemingly hopeless case and breathe hope into it again. She knocks on the door, and the old man appears, accompanied by the creatures he's saved. He reluctantly takes the young puppy into his care and gets to work, his home littered with all kinds of animals broken or mangled in their own way, but all worth saving. Because life is worthy and beautiful, even if it is not always pretty. Meanwhile, Laila has landed in the city of Panjim carrying a book of poetry, hoping that something in there would help her break the ice with Darius. But as she gets in the taxi to head to Palolem, she realizes that there is so much she doesn't know anymore. She doesn't know what she would say to Darius after the way they left things. She doesn't know how she would convince him not to create immortality. And most importantly, she doesn't know what she's getting out of all this. After all, it's not like she cares about her job anymore or even wants it back. And she's died so many times that she's not afraid of herself anymore. So the biggest unknown to her at this point is why she's even going to see Darius in the first place. Later that day, Darius has done all he can for the pup and sends the girl away, telling her she can visit check on his progress. But as she does so, he recognizes a familiar face approaching his door. He lets her inside to have a proper conversation, confessing that he was unkind the last time they met, that he looked for her in every place where death followed him in his life, but he never could find her, that he regretted how he treated her. Laila confesses in kind, saying that all she wanted was to convince him not to invent immortality, that she went so far as to try to kill him when he was a baby, even though she couldn't go through with it. To this, Darius laughs uproariously and tells her to follow. He gestures to the puppy fighting for his life on the table and points out that, despite how close he is to death, despite what he'll need to sacrifice to live, he's still breathing. "This is what I have learned in all my years, Laila Starr," Darius says. "We are strong, all mortal things. We live because we truly desire to. Do you understand? Each heartbeat, every breath, is a rejection of death." And that's when he declares that he invented immortality 3 weeks after his 49th birthday. And that night, he thought of celebrating, telling everyone that he conquered death once and for all. But instead, he did things he hadn't done in years. He ate cotton candy at the fair, he saw a movie by himself, gave his leftover popcorn to a homeless man, and walked home late at night. He then put the secret to unending life in a shoebox and placed it on the top shelf in his closet where it remains still. Naturally, Layla is confused by this. If he already invented it, why hasn't he used it? To this, Darius deflects and insists they sit by the shacks on the beach where they count the boats and the men dragging nets full of fish. And as the sun sets, Darius confesses that he thought she came for him today. They found a brain tumor and told him he had 6 to 10 months to live. That was 14 months ago. He further states that his pursuit to conquer death alienated him to all else, most of all his son. And when his son needed him the most, he was too busy fighting his own grief to be of any use. And as a result, he hasn't spoken to him in years. Laila apologizes, but Darius stops her. "That's just it, you see?" he says. "We all lived these fragile, imperfect lives. You are not to blame. I made my own way here. And now, before I go, all I want is to see Neil and tell him I wish I could have been better. Here at the end, I finally see how beautiful it all is. I realize I spent my whole life chasing a miracle. But this is it, isn't it? This is the miracle. This place, the sand, the sky, the sea beyond. No grand magic. Just a quiet breath taken to yourself. I sought the greatest feat, to cheat death. And here, the real miracle is a 3-legged pup clinging desperately to life." The two met every day after that. He never asked her to stay, but there was nowhere else she'd rather be. They took in more helpless cases, saving some and losing others. When he took a turn for the worse, she held his hand and saw that it was just as frail and unsure and hopeful as when he had been a baby. And when it became clear that his time was close, she begged him to use his own invention. She begged him to save his own life, but he refused. Instead, he called his son and asked him to come visit. He agrees and arrives a few days later. Both he and Laila awkwardly navigate the tension between them in this situation. It's at this point that she decides it's best for her to leave, struggling to say goodbye. But Darius spots her before she goes, thanking her for everything, and tells her to take the old shoebox in the closet with her. It is hers to do with as she pleases. He stands at the beach with the shoebox in hand, when she is joined by Prana, making a joke to break the tension. Laila simply states that he's dying, that there's nothing she could do to stop it. and he says the only thing you can say in this situation. I know. I'm sorry. The two embrace, and the shoebox falls to the edge of the shore, and our story ends with one last thought about endings. Who is to say exactly how things end? If there's one thing I have learned, it's that life's endings are bereft of answers. Was Darius Shaw truly visited by death in his last day? Did that mean Laila Starr had her job back? Or did life resign itself to death? And did Laila and Prana set out to new beginnings on a beach somewhere in Goa? Perhaps such things are better left in closed boxes instead of drift out into sea. Perhaps it is enough to remember at story's end the miracle that it was simply to have lived. The concept of death as an actual person is nothing new in comics. It's been done a surprising amount of times, with the most famous example being Neil Gaiman's Death from Sandman, in which Death is a cute little goth girl. Don't take that as a diss, by the way, she's a great character. In fact, that interpretation of Death even had her own story in which she experienced life as immortal, called Death, the High Cost of Living, for which this story is partially based. But despite crossing familiar territory, there is something unmistakably unique about the many deaths of Laila Starr, outside of the fact that its characters and settings are based largely in Hindu mythology. And I think a big reason for that is how the topic of death is treated in general. See, in most traditional stories about death, at least in Western culture, death is often used in stories as a way to amplify what makes life worth living. It treats death as a finite conclusion, where our soul is taken to one of two places, and that's it. Life is over. And while there are elements of that for sure within the story, the way it treats death conceptually and literally feels a little different here. And I believe a large part of that comes down to the book's idea of what it actually means to be immortal. Now, I want to preface this by saying my understanding of what I'm going to talk about now is very surface level, so I apologize in advance if I get any major details wrong or I'm off base in any significant way. With that being said, my understanding of death in Hinduism is that our bodies are not our beginning and our end. They are simply vessels for our souls that will eventually pass on, at which point our soul is free to be reincarnated based on our karma, our deeds in life. And this process continues over many, many lifetimes until our soul becomes enlightened enough to reach moksha, the process in which our souls become absorbed with Brahman, the one true Hindu god. And in the spirit of that, death is not treated as the end, it's just treated as the end of this chapter. That their soul will find a new vessel and fulfill a new life where it will grow from the seeds planted within the last. But that doesn't mean that we're not allowed to mourn, because it is still sad and it will still break your heart, but death is not cruel here. It is simply part of the cycle. And I think that's what the many deaths of Laila Starr is ultimately about. It's about the cycle of life and death, how both are essential to each other, and how both contribute to what it actually means to be immortal. Because while Laila's quest might be to try to stop the creation of immortality, her journey is actually discovering it for herself through the process of reincarnation. With each new death and each new life bringing with it different perspectives and a different lesson on what it means to live, what it means to be human, what it means to have a soul worth cherishing. Because life has no meaning without death, and death has no meaning without life. Both are essential to existence. And while death is often treated as a cold, painful end, maybe that's too simplistic of an identity, one that we crafted out of a fear of the unknown. And while death is real and heavy and painful, it's also what makes life precious and beautiful. Because sometimes the only way to appreciate the beauty of our lives and the people in them is to know that one day will be the last we ever get to see or feel it. But even then, death is not the end. Not really. Death is simply part of the journey, not just for ourselves, but those we leave behind, and the memories we leave, and the lessons we gave. This is something Darius becomes all too familiar with. Death became a frequent companion to his life, both literally and figuratively, to the point where all he saw was the pain it gave him and how much he wanted it to stop, plagued by the death of those who left such marks on him that he would carry for the rest of his life. But it's not until the end of his life that he truly begins to understand what the immortality he so desperately sought actually is. It's not in keeping our mortal vessels going, but in keeping our souls growing, expanding into new horizons, and spreading it to others to help them grow too. After all, is immortality really just keeping the mortal body alive? And what good is immortality if you don't feed the soul? And is it even possible to keep your soul fed if you never set it free. With each life that came and went during his existence, he understood more of what it meant to be human, even when it would take him most of his life to realize it. Through Barden, he learned that even the thickest skin contains something sweet. Through Safar, that people can take parts of you when they die. And even with his wife and friend, that obsession with grief of the dead can lead to losing the living. They're painful lessons, as all involving death are, but important all the same. It's always sad and never easy. I think the only character to truly understand this from the very beginning is Para, the god of life. See, from the outset, the god of life adores death, while death remains apathetic. When she starts to doubt herself, Prana is the first one to remind her of her importance, that he is nothing without her. And in a way, he's right. As much as we praise life and fear death, one means nothing without the other. And I think, in a way, Laila understands this too by book's end. She's experienced death now in so many ways, experienced the pain, the shame, and the guilt that it carries. The fear of how to carry on with the constant weight of living with it on her shoulders. And in doing so, for the first time in eternity, recognizes the value of life and the delicate balance between his role and hers. The cycle of both that must continue. And this is why she allows him to embrace her as they walk away in the sunset, leaving immortality adrift at sea with the many souls that dwell within it. For longtime viewers of these editorials, it shouldn't surprise you to know that I thought a lot about my mom when I read this. After all, the time of writing, it's been less than 2 months since she passed, so it's still pretty fresh. It'll be over a year by the time this video actually comes out. For those who don't know, she passed away in early 2022 after a long battle with alcoholism. I've made a couple videos on the subject before and after she passed, if you want more context. I actually read the story for the first time only a couple weeks after she passed, and I remember feeling like I read something important, but I wasn't ready to understand it yet. I wasn't ready to perceive death as a friend and a part of what makes life special. I would much rather think of it as an act of cruelty imposed on our lives. But weeks later, couldn't get it out of my head. Something about this book demanded that I take another look. And in doing so, found a new perspective, I think. I'm not gonna pretend that I'm okay with what happened, because I'm not. I can't say what everyone wants me to say and say I'm fine, because I'm not fine. I'm still heartbroken, and I still feel guilty, even though I know it wasn't my fault. Even a year later, those feelings are still there. But I'm not angry anymore. I'm not angry at death. I'm not angry that she took her from me and left me with all the pieces. I think through Laila Starr, I'm coming to understand that death in of itself is not cruel. The process in which we get there can be. It can be hard and unfair, but death itself is simply a release. It's our mortal vessels giving way for a grander spiritual truth. Now, that doesn't necessarily make grief easier. Doesn't mean the feeling of loss suddenly stop, but I feel like I understand it better, or at the very least, have reframed it in my head to not be as malicious as I once interpreted it. And there is comfort in that. And believing that death is simply a part of the natural cycle. Universal to all one way or another, neither good nor bad, but simply what you make of it. I think I've accepted that there's no getting over an event like death, especially a death of someone close. There's no moving on, there's no closure, only living with. Learning how to grow around this massive hole that they took with them. I'm not sure what to do with mine yet. I tell myself it leaves more room for light to shine in, but I don't feel that way just yet. Right now, it still feels like a massive, gaping wound. But I like the idea of death being kind, or as confused as I am. Almost like an old friend who is learning about the experience with you, no matter how many times they've seen it before. A friend that understands the weight and helps you carry it. That doesn't act from malice or cruel intentions, simply doing what they must because the time has come, whether either of us like it or not. That death was kind to my mom and helped her in her time of need. Both her and my mom are standing over me right now with their hand on my shoulders, whispering to me that it's okay. That she'll take care of her and help her find her way to the next life. I am not a religious man. Spiritual maybe, but not religious. I identify as agnostic, which means I don't pretend to have a clue what happens after we die, but I do genuinely hope that the soul is real, that it can be handled with care by a deity that understands the beauty of the life that came before. And maybe that soul will come back in some form, who knows? It's nice to think about anyway. Now, I don't want you to walk away from this video thinking I'm trying to convert you to Hinduism or to imply that death should be sought out in any way. That's not what's happening. What I'm trying to say is that death hurts. It sucks. But I think there's room to really consider how death plays into our lives. We can recognize not just that it might not be the end-all be-all that we frame it as, but that recognizing how it makes us feel in all its complexity can open our eyes to beauty we may not have seen before. It is not a substitute for grief, nor should it be. Grief is real and necessary and demands to be felt. But I think with time and healing, we can recognize this great cyclical dance of life for all its joys and heartbreaks. We can recognize that everything within it serves a purpose, even if our heart is too heavy to fully embrace it. It may take time to do so, maybe even a whole lifetime. But whenever you do, I hope you can find fulfillment in that. And you can feed your soul with the beauty that life can bring and also its end. And if you're able to do that and pass it on to those you hold dear, then you, my friend, have just discovered the key to true immortality.